Ready to revolutionize your higher ed marketing game?
Yes.
Well, then don't miss out on Element 451's Engage Summit, June 27 and 28. Explore the cutting edge world of education and AI technology and unleash your creativity like never before. Register today at engage.element451.com and use promo code EdUp50 for $50 off. 3 higher ed authors, 100 plus college and university presidents, dozens of actionable insights for academic leaders. Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education, is now available on Amazon. Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to ed up on the EdUp Experience podcast, where we make education your business. Dr. Joe Salustio back with you in another episode. Oh boy, I was reading this morning. If you read the news, I get Google alerts all about higher education every day. So when I sit down and have breakfast with my wife and kids, I'm reading all these articles about higher education. And one that caught my eye today, and you're going to see this manifesting itself. You've probably seen it by now as this episode comes out. There's a flagship university called West Virginia University. And in the news today, Gordon Gee, the president of West Virginia, announces $75 million of cuts to the institution to ready them for the future of higher education. They're overbuilt. And I think that's a story for a lot of colleges and universities today. We know that because M&A, mergers and acquisitions are discussed much more in higher education than they ever have been before. And we see stories, probably every week, of another college that's either merged or acquired. We're having conversations about financial sustainability much more often than institutions were 10 years ago. We know there's an enrollment cliff. We know there's COVID impact. We know there's less students in college. There just is a lot. And colleges, for the most part, they have money. And that money that they have is typically in some type of an endowment fund. And the idea would be, and we'll talk to our guest about this, that you take money that's in an endowment fund and that money makes more money. And with that more money that you make, then you reinvest that, or you become self-sustaining for the future. You become future-proofed against market and financial fluctuations. Is that true? How does this all work? Who the heck manages all this stuff? And when you're having a multi-million dollar, hopefully you have a multi-million dollar or billion-dollar endowment. We brought on an expert today to talk about what the heck is going on in this endowment world. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen. He's John Griffith. He's the endowment specialist, or an endowment specialist at Hirtle Callaghan. What's going on, John? How are you?
It's great to be here. I'm excited to get Ed up today.
Oh, I love it. We always like to level set, John. You know this. What is Hirtle Callaghan? What do you do? How do you do it?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So Hirtle Callaghan is a chief investment officer firm, and we founded that space about 35 years ago. And the idea of a chief investment officer firm is to kind of democratize the best investment offices in the world. So think of an Ivy League investment office, only we provide services to the average clients. People, we have clients who are up to $1.5 billion and some that have $20 million endowments. And so we provide the same level of investment expertise, access to low manager fees that you would get if you were a Harvard or Yale, but we do that for the average endowment.
Wow. Okay. So what kind of amounts are we talking about here that Hirtle Callaghan manages for institutions across the U.S.? We're talking a couple of million, probably not, probably more than that, right?
Yeah. So we manage in total about $20 billion in assets. Money. And our clients range in size from $1.5 billion to 20 million. And the idea of what we do is we provide independent investment service regardless of the size to our clients. And so unlike where most people are limited in what you can invest in, because the best managers only want to work in large quantities. If you invest in large quantities, you get lower fees. And obviously the larger your organization, the better experts you can hire to make more money. And so the advantage of being a smaller part of a $20 billion organization is that you get the benefits of a $20 billion organization, even if you have a $100 million endowment.
Okay, so let's get to benefits, because this is an interesting conversation. We'll talk about higher education and its future in a little bit. But why would I want, if I'm an institution and I say lucky enough, if I'm lucky enough to have $20 million or more that I want to invest and that I'm probably investing, what is the benefit to having a chief investment officer like Hirtle Callaghan behind me? Wouldn't my CFO do this? Wouldn't my in-house financial people do it? I mean, give me the landscape of how this typically works.
Yeah, so your CFO traditionally is too busy to do it. So that's kind of a really old model. I was a college CFO, and you're too busy to do that. You had a lot of other things going on. There's no time to manage that. Plus, it's a different level of expertise. It's access to managers. It's making investment decisions based on market moves and what's happening in the market and the outlook and Fed funds rate. And there's so much to it that if you go back 30 years ago, when I started in this business, there were two asset classes. There were stocks and bonds. And then people started saying, well, maybe we could even invest in international stocks. And then from there, it became hedge funds and real asset funds and private equity and venture capital and crypto funds. And there's never ending. So the sophistication of investment options has exploded. And so you really cannot do it without a sophisticated team. And
yeah, I mean, universities, and I know this because I've talked to many people just like you, where it's like they're investing in lots of other stuff that you wouldn't typically think that a university might invest in. And it takes an expert to do that. You need to have significant expertise because money moves, right? Money just doesn't sit. You have to move it. You have to watch market fluctuations and so on. That means, though, that if you have somebody who's watching this, that means there's opportunities for and there's risks against, or I'm going to say against, there's risks to that money. What are some of the opportunities, some of the risk factors that are either helping or threatening endowments these days? Because boy, oh boy, we can't lose money in endowments. We're already losing too many students.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think of investment risk. You can't look at investment risk in isolation. And so I like to say to people, would you rather, increase your equity exposure in your endowment or count on your enrollment person to bring in 10 extra students at a lower discount rate next year? And so, and if you think about the risks, we used to generate all of our growth from enrollment. And as enrollment growth becomes much more difficult and that tuition is shrinking, people are looking to the endowment to provide that growth engine in the future, which is putting more pressure on people to increase their investment returns.
Can you talk about restricted, unrestricted? Because a lot of endowment money is restricted. And I don't think unless, somebody who's worked in advancement or maybe in finance, and there's a lot of folks throughout higher education that hear these terms thrown around: restricted, unrestricted, operational dollars. And what can I use? What can't I use? How do I take money out if we need it? And an endowment is typically overseen by a board, right? The board has access to it. So there's board. Can you talk about how the internal structure works typically from your experience?
Yeah, sure. So there's a wide confusion. Legally, an endowment is a donor gives you a gift. It's a gift in perpetuity where you can spend the interest and dividends or some kind of a low spending rate off it, but you can never spend the principal. So I give you, the idea is I give you a $1 million gift that funds a $50,000 scholarship. Next year, your $1 million gift will be worth $1,500,000. $1,050,000, and then it will provide a little bit more money as the cost of the scholarship goes up. So the idea is I endow a scholarship today, that scholarship will be able to be funded forever, because as the market grows, the endowment, the spending will grow as you increase it. So, but what we've done to our endowment is we now basically throw in a lot of other money. You have operating surpluses that schools put in that added to the endowment. You have gifts that someone's given to you that isn't endowed, and you choose to put it in the endowment. So sometimes when you say endowment, what you're really talking about is long-term investments. It's the assets you put aside for long-term investments. The restricted endowment, our donors had restricted it for you, but a lot of the money can be unrestricted. And so it's interesting. Most people assume that endowments are grown through gifts. The reality is a lot of endowments are grown through operating surpluses and kind of saving your money. What do you do with your operating surplus at the end of the year? You spend it on facilities or you put it in the endowment.
Okay, so I've got a donor. They give me $1 million. It's restricted, and to your point, in perpetuity. It's supposed to grow every year, and I'm not going to touch that million. But if I make $50,000 on it, maybe I'm giving out a $25,000 scholarship, and I have $25,000 left over that continues to grow, and so on. Or my university makes a profit or surplus, depending on what you want to call it, and I take that $1 million of margin and I decide to invest that and call that part of my endowment. What does endowment mean actually? Is it just a savings account? Is it, what's the definition of an endowment?
Well, so, there's the legal definition that I gave you, but I think most people use the endowment as a long-term investment pool. It's the assets you've put aside that you don't intend to spend and you intend to invest in the future. That's not to say if it's unrestricted, if it's your operating surpluses you put in, the board can vote to take that money out. And so it's an important part of my job is to make sure I understand what are the components within the endowment. So it's not just an endowment fund. There are different pools of money that have different purposes.
Interesting. And so how do you work typically so if you're working with a board, the board comes to you and says, hey, look, we're thinking about taking money out of our endowment, or maybe the board doesn't, or the president comes to you and says, you go, no, don't do that because of the market. Or you go, this is a great time for you to take money out. Are you typically, is it proactive? Is it reactive, depending on how the requests move through you? I'm sure you're getting a lot of requests for how much is this and what is that and how much does this go up and all that.
Yeah, so your question gets to what we do that's special at Hirtle Callaghan, which is we do in-depth planning with our clients. So my background is not in investments. I'm a former college CFO who works to make sure that our investment people understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of the colleges we work with. What's the probability they're going to ask to take a bunch of money out for facilities? So we look and see how do you fund your facilities? Do you have debt capacity? Do you have donors that are going to give it to you? Do you have money set aside in your operating budget for it? So if you are an organization that has a likelihood of wanting to take a large amount of money out of your endowment, not just your annual spend, but some large amount for capital, then we're going to invest you in a different way than we would invest someone who says, no, we got debt capacity, we got donors, we're not going to use any of our endowment money for this. And so what I like to do with clients is segregate that money. If there's money that you might take out, then maybe you need a different asset allocation than you do for your permanent endowment or money that you don't intend to take out. And so I think the mistake some people make is they throw that all in the same pool of money, and it's inappropriate because some need to be invested for the long term. And sometimes if there's a possibility of you taking the money out, we have a different investment strategy for those.
I think that's right. I think that's pretty common in higher ed as you talk to folks. And if they're not in the finance office or have that level of financial savvy, if a school has a $500 million endowment, you think that it's all sitting in one account worth $500 million and you're just taking it out like your savings, like you're paying your bills. Yeah. But what we're really talking about is short-term liquid assets. We're talking about all different types of CDs, annuities. I mean, I know colleges that have bought gold and silver and all sorts of investments like that. But what you're talking about is how is the financial profile of the institution reflecting how they invest their money? What are we going to do short term that we need liquid cash for? What do we not need to do? And let's put that money away. That makes what? Schools more responsive. It makes them more flexible if they need that money, especially if they're not as well off as other schools, right? And so that you must have smaller schools that maybe have a more flexible spend allocation or investment allocation than maybe those that have $1.5 billion. Probably don't need as much flexibility, right?
Well, so you've hit on one of the major fallacies, which is you don't invest your endowment based on the size. And so the NACUBO benchmark study always, ranks, schools of under 25 million, 25 to 50. And it's the easiest way to compare. But what really matters is you should invest based on your individual school's facts and circumstances. And so to get your asset allocation correct, you need to do an assessment of what are the strengths and weaknesses, how large are your reserves, do you have debt capacity, do you have operating margin, how much are you spending from your endowment, what percentage of your income comes from your endowment. And so you pool all those things together along with some of the discussion about your capital plans to decide how much risk can an organization take. And so you could have an organization that's got a $25 million endowment that can take more risk than an organization with a $100 million endowment. And so
that's a fact. That's a fact.
And so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking through this, and by the way, I'm fascinated by this because do universities in general understand that they need to be, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but proactive and have incredible strategic foresight with the money that they do have in an endowment? Or is it more like, oh, we have an endowment and it's, over here? I mean, can you talk about that? Is there a convincing process that you have to go through? Like, hey, so-and-so XYZ University, if you don't do these things, you're going to be hurting later. And what's the response like? And I just wonder if there's just this deep understanding of, yes, thank you, John, for your advice. We have a very aggressive portfolio of investment with X, Y, Z, and B's and A's. It doesn't seem like it'd be as clean as that.
Yeah, it's not as clean as that. I think so. We have a structure that we go through that talks about what is your objective in your endowment fund? What are you trying to achieve? And then we look at your ability to take risk. Then we look at your willingness to take risk. And so let me walk you through an example. So we had a school in California, university was in very good financial shape. They were spending a pretty low, less than 4% from their endowment. They had a pretty conservative asset allocation. And their rationale was, well, we are only spending 4%, so we don't really need to have that aggressive an asset allocation. And so the planning that I did with them focused on what are the needs of the university. And it took a while to get to it, but eventually one of the trustees said, we're really concerned about this demographic cliff. You've heard of this, the demographic cliff that's coming, Joe?
I haven't heard about it.
It was news to me as well. And so they were really concerned about it. But it was California, that cliff is in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so they were worried about that. And I said, well, if there was ever a reason to increase your equity exposure, it would to prepare yourself to fund the demographic cliff in 10 years. And so
nailed it.
As soon as we gave them a reason, a purpose to increase their equity allocation, they did. And so they mistakenly believed their objective was to spend 4%. What they didn't understand was the endowment could help solve another problem for them. So you really can't just go to a board and say, we think you should take more investment risk because you'll earn more money. You really have to have a process, think it through, reassure them what would happen. An exercise I do with clients is what would happen if there's a 30% drop in the endowment? Work with the CFO and come up with a plan and look at that. And the reality is the concern you have over a 30% drop in the endowment is much greater than the reality of it.
Are you sure?
I'm positive.
Yeah, I know you are. When you say go to a board, do you typically go to a board, or you or somebody from Hirtle Callaghan goes to a board and says, hey, this is what we think you should do? Is there a representative of a board? Do you have an investment committee of some kind that you're dealing with? Because board structures can be very different. Can you talk about your portfolio of clients and how that communication typically flows to you and Hirtle Callaghan?
Yeah, so traditionally the boards have investment committees. And the investment committees worked with the outsourced provider to make investment decisions and asset allocation. So we are a fully discretionary firm. So we make investment decisions on behalf of our clients. So we don't go back to investment committees and say, do you think we should do this or think we should do that? We make those decisions ourselves and then work with knowing what, they're our clients. So we know what they want and know what they're trying to achieve. But we don't ask. Every move we make we're not granted permission for it. Our work with them is mostly about helping to understand their needs and their objectives over the long term, not focused on whether this fund is better than that fund. And so the mistake that investment committees have made in the past is spending all their time arguing over, which is the best large cap manager. And the asset allocation that you have that results in 92% of your investment returns. And so we focus on talking about the asset allocation because that's where the real value is, optimizing your asset allocation. Arguing whether this manager is better than that manager provides very little value in the long term.
You will learn by the numbers. I will teach you.
Don't settle for average marketing strategies. Join us at the Element 451 Engage Summit, June 27 and 28, and discover how to harness the power of AI technology in higher ed marketing. Connect with industry leaders, explore cutting-edge technologies, and future-proof your marketing strategy. Use promo code EdUp50 for $50 off. Register now at engage.element451.com. You know that the world of higher education is experiencing evolutions and revolutions. You want to be part of the progress. Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education with insights from more than 100 college and university presidents, will show you how. Get your copy of Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education now on Amazon right away. We think you're going to love it. It's
amazing.
So said John. Talk about, we always is fascinating, like, does a college president get involved in this? Is this, because we talk about what's the profile of a leader for the future. And typically, if you're, the path to a presidency traditionally has been through academics, and it's dean, and it's provost, and it's, president. And then you talk about something like this, and you go, is this more sales and finance? And there's so many facets to the job. Is the president, from your experience, typically involved in this, understand it, aware? Is it a spectrum? Is it the board that really is more doing this? Talk about involvement from a university perspective.
Yeah, so the primarily it's the board and the CFO. Presidents are involved, and I think they should be involved because no one is better describing what the needs of the university or college are than the president. And so I'm working with a school now in Pittsburgh, and the president's on this small committee to look at this, and he's very articulate on what the vision is and what needs to happen. And we're looking to increase the equity exposure for this client, which is risk to the president, right? He may get more funding, but markets don't always go up, and so it could get less funding. And so it's critical that he understand the risk, but also help us understand what is he trying to achieve. And so presidents do not need to understand why this hedge fund is different than that hedge fund, or what the difference between private equity and venture is. But the investment committee should be run in such a way that even someone who doesn't know anything about investments can understand what's happening at the institution, understand risks, understand trade-offs. And investment committees should be managed in a way that trustees who are not investment experts have a say on what we do.
I was just going to ask that. Do the boards that you're typically working with have board members with expertise in this? I would say this in finance, is where the dialogue isn't just one way, where there's a deep understanding of what this means, or are boards not, because higher ed boards, there's a lot of makeups of boards, and sometimes they don't all have the expertise needed to operate in all areas. Is it a spectrum? I mean, I'm sure there's so many different kinds, but typically, is there enough knowledge on a board, or you're educating as you go along?
Yeah, educating as you go along. So traditionally, a board will have a few members, and he or she, but who really do understand investments in a deep way. And then you might have other people who might be in the investment field. A great example was a friend of mine was on a board, and they made her the investment chair. Well, she's a banker who loans money to hedge funds. So is she in finance? Yes. Does she know anything about managing an endowment? No. Yikes. So you've got finance experts, but you don't necessarily have people who manage money professionally.
I get it. All right. So here's one of the big questions I've had. I've kind of saved it. Are endowments going up, or are endowments going down, John? I mean, what's going on with higher education endowments right now?
Well, I think that there is more focus on endowments providing a growth engine to institutions. And then the Kubo benchmark survey has for years asked, what's your targeted return? What are you trying to achieve? And for about a decade, it was a 7. 7% was what your targeted return is. A year ago, that went from 7 to 7.5, then it went up to 8. Now, this latest report was 8.3. And so boards are really looking for higher return and thus need to have more private assets in their endowment. They need to have more equity exposure, and they need to dial down their bond exposure. And so there's a lot of pressure. I mean, that 7% required return had been steady for decades, and suddenly it's now at 8.3. And so that tells you the pressure that endowments are now feeling to grow. And so to answer your questions, endowments are growing.
Do you think that's a direct response? Do you think there's any correlation between declining enrollment, less tuition fee revenue, and now we've got to look for other revenue streams? We've got an endowment. We can get it by 1%. It's going to offset our loss of students. Is a correlation there? Is it discussed in that way with you?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, diversifying your revenue stream. I think the interesting piece is that, or unfortunate piece is that, the time to invest for the future was 10 years ago. And so to suddenly decide you want to have a growth portfolio, it takes 5-10 years for that to really become a meaningful improvement to the school. That's not to say you shouldn't do it, but it's not an immediate replacement for your students.
Is there immediacy and expectation right now? Is it
Yes.
hey, John, we need this endowment to grow. We need it next year.
Yeah. And yes. And I think that is really directly related to the enrollment situation. But you have to remember, 70% of all endowments are less than $100 million. So 70% are less than 100 million. So most schools, the endowment provides 5% or so of their revenue. So a significant improvement in their endowment returns will give incremental revenue to the school, but it's not the savior. Few schools will ever be able to be put in a situation where the endowment will be the major solution.
Do you think you worked in higher ed as a CFO, the enrollment cliff and the consequences of that are real, and schools are already feeling it. The COVID helped it moved consequence along even faster. And are endowments, I guess when I say what's happening with endowments, are they slimming? Is there more coming out of those endowments than the past because universities need more cash to operate, move cash to operating funds? Are you seeing more withdrawals? I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah, so what you're asking is the spending rate gone up and down?
That's exactly what I'm asking. Yeah, you didn't know that. Yeah, thanks for translating.
Yeah. I just want to thank you for teaching me a new word today, Joe.
Yes.
So the spending rate is creeping up a little bit. It hasn't creeped up as much as you would expect based on the average endowment spending rate is 4.3%. And that's up a little. It was closer to 4. It's gone up a little. The pandemic did not have a material effect on that. And I think that's because the government funding was so great. And so in Pennsylvania, I live in Pennsylvania, the state had said you could spend up to 10% from your endowment if you need to because of COVID.
Wow.
And very few organizations took advantage of that. First, it's just because it will really harm your ability to grow the endowment, but they didn't really need it because the COVID funding from the federal government was so plentiful. So we haven't seen the push up in spending that you would expect. I expect it's going to happen, but if you want to spend more, you need to earn more. And so you can't just decide, I want to increase my spending. You have to also increase the equity exposure so you'll earn more money. And so that's the rub that people have. Everyone wants more money, but not everyone is willing to take more investment risk.
Yeah, right. So make more money, but take more risk. And if you take more risk and you lose money, that's what risk means. It means you're taking the opportunity to put yourself in a more vulnerable position with the hope of greater gains. But we know the market's been up and down. It's been crazy over the last, you'll even look at the last 2 years, the fluctuations have been pretty significant. Has that changed the investment strategies much? You know, are people moving to more aggressive strategies? Or are they nervous? Boards really nervous about what's happening? Is there, okay, no, this is the time to invest and take risk? Is it in the middle?
So you're highlighting one of the big misconceptions there is, which is that
I'm asking a lot of these questions.
You're providing great questions. So the endowment might go down 30%, but the way we spend the endowment is we use some kind of a smoothing mechanism. So we might take 4% of a 12-quarter average. And so you don't really feel a 30% decline. You might feel a 10% decline. And then that 10% decline in spending also has to be measured against the fact that you only get 5% of your revenue from the endowment. So when you play it all out, it's a $50,000, $100,000 reduction in revenue. And so the mistake people make is they equate the millions of dollars you lost in the stock market, which is just timing, it's volatility, it comes back, with what happens on operations. And so the first thing I do when we look and talk about risk is make sure people are looking at risk to the operations, because that's the real risk. What you're talking about an investment, that's just volatility. Stocks go up and down.
So you could lose 30%, and then in a week, you're going to gain that 30% back, but your operations remain sound. But you don't see a lot of a reduction in endowment to fund operations more or less than the past, do you?
No, well, it's the final move that schools do if they really are having funding problems. And of course, you can't spend. So remember, you can't spend the restricted endowment. So when we're talking about spending endowment, we're talking about spending the unrestricted component. And so that's one of the warning signs you have is how much unrestricted endowment is there left and how quickly has that been being utilized. Is
there a average, if you say of all the endowments that you're managing at Hirtle Callaghan, typically there's 10% unrestricted and 90% restricted, or 90% unrestricted and 10% restricted. Is there like a calc?
No. So there are schools that are 95% unrestricted and there's schools with 95% restricted. And some of it is the culture of the school. So there's some schools that are deep in history of philanthropy, and those have more likely have restricted endowments. Other schools have been fortunate enough to have operating surpluses, and that's the source of their revenue. And so it's usually dominated by one of those or the other. But the schools that have had the most success obviously use both approaches. They're putting aside operating surpluses, and they're also fundraising for the endowment.
Wow, why I love having you on it. It's this part of higher education that is definitely not discussed as much as other parts. I feel like we teach students and we run admissions and we have retention and we do all of these things, teaching and learning and so on, accreditation, blah blah. But investment portfolio management is something that exists within higher education, but it doesn't get a shining light often until you need it. Until you really need it, right? And then it's like, okay, where's all the money? And typically, as leaders move up through the ranks in higher education, it's not something you get great exposure to. It's not like they have a course in how to manage your endowment to prepare you for a presidency. You might fall into this and go, okay, who manages the endowment? And what is it? So it's really great to have you on to give this perspective to us. What else do we need to know about Hirtle Callaghan? Anything you want to say about your work there? Open mic.
Yeah. So the most important thing, one of the reasons I joined Hirtle Callaghan is that it is a conflict-free independent firm. And so as a fiduciary, as a CFO or as a trustee, I want someone who's making the decisions, what's best for my university. I don't want someone making decisions based on what's financially best for them. And so in the financial services industry, people, I work at JP Morgan, and so I put you in a JP Morgan fund. And so a piece of that fund expenditure revenue comes back to me, or you do custody in my custody bank, I get a piece back, or I use a manager who gives me a kickback. And so investment industry is so conflicted with revenue streams coming from different directions And what Hirtle Callaghan offers, and there are other firms that do, but most do not. Most firms are not independent and are not conflict free. And so what we provide is you pay us a fee and we give you the best investment advice. We tell you, this is the best manager. We're going to invest in this manager. We're not investing in a manager because we have a financial incentive in it. And so it's amazing to me that trustees and fiduciaries focus
You said it.
don't focus on this independence and the conflict free, because being conflict free means I'm working for my schools. I'm not working for myself. And I think we might make the wrong decision, but we didn't make the wrong decision because we had a financial incentive behind it. And so.
Yeah. And by the way, one last question before I give you the final one to close the episode. Are there schools out there right now where they're internally trying to manage this through a CFO and it's, you look at it and go, whoa, or is that not typical that they're using some kind of investment firm?
Yeah. So 50% of all college and universities, maybe it's 52% now, use outsourced chief investment officer firms. So the other people either have their own independent investment office or their trustees do it with the advice of a consultant. And so the issue with the consulting model is that it's not timely. We used that for a while when I was at both the University of New Hampshire and at Bryn Mawr, and it's delayed. So, but when you have an opportunity in the stock market, you have to have an investment committee, you have to educate all the trustees, and by the time you make a decision, the opportunity may have left you.
Yikes!
And so only about 50% of all, it goes up about 2% a year. Every year there's about 2% more that use it. I think it's by far the best model. I think a part-time trustee-led effort is very risky, mostly because you might have a great trustee group now, but there's no guarantee that the next person who chairs your investment committee will be so great. And there's a lot of risk in that, and there's no oversight. So if you're an investment committee, there is no oversight. You are the oversight. But if you hire an outsourced firm like Hirtle Callaghan, the investment committee provides that oversight. And so there are lots of firms that don't use OCIO and should.
Yeah, and the regulations, and there's so many regulations in banking. Banking and tax accounting and all of those things, very regulation heavy. You have to have great corporate hygiene. There's a lot of benefits to having a external chief investment officer because they can take care of a lot of that corporate hygiene, I bet, as well.
The paperwork and the legal work is enormous.
Yeah.
And so that alone is a reason for someone to decide to outsource.
What do you see for the future of higher education, John? I mean, you're working with these colleges. Tell us what you see in your crystal ball. So
I'll tell you what I'm optimistic about. And overall, I have lots of concern about higher education, but what excites me are the partnerships and mergers that are happening of strong institutions. Salus University and Drexel University announced a partnership the other day, and they're both financially strong, and they're doing it for mission reason and program reasons, and it will make both institutions stronger. And I'm much more interested in those types of things where people understand the future is cloudy. Let's strengthen our future by making actions today. I'm disappointed or concerned about the schools that decide too late that they need to do something. And that's just the continuing theme of people, 2 weeks before they run out of cash, they start looking for a merger partner. And that's just sad.
Isn't that fascinating, though? I've talked about that here in the podcast, particularly when you're working with your nonprofit board versus your for-profit school, as an example, and you're selling your school to anyone. There's a payout, so you have some kind of incentive. As a nonprofit board, you have fiduciary responsibility, but there's no incent. There's nothing to incent you to take specific action other than your belief in the mission and the continuation of the college. It's not like there's some grand event. And so you see this, I don't know, I think it's a lack of willingness to forego some level of control over the identity. That a lot of schools go, well, we're not going to give control of this, 100-year-old institution to these other people. What are they going to do with our identity? We'll try to go it alone. And then you're right, a month before, they realize, oh, wait, we don't have operating income, we don't have any money, then we got to close. And it affects so many students.
Yeah, I think the trustee problem is that trustees are conflicted. They're not independent. They are they're your best donors. They're your cheerleaders. They are the people who love your institution. And so it's hard for them to be independent and look and say, I love my alma mater, but maybe its continuation is not in the best interest of it. And so it really has much more to do. I don't think there's ill intent. I think it's just the love of the institution blinds people to, the reality.
That's a really good point. Nobody's ever brought that up before, but you're right. It's not a completely objective decision, right? It's like, even if you personally have given money to a university and you go, okay, wait a minute, I've personally helped this university and now I'm voting for its demise somehow, or at least in my eyes, its demise somehow, even though that may not even be the case, it sure may seem like it's me at the time. And so I'd rather go it alone and try to give it its best shot. I could see how that would be a huge conflict.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, trustees, you go to trustee meetings and they talk about, this is the dining hall where I met my husband, and this is the, so that's the kind of connection that people have to these places. And that doesn't necessarily make the best leaders when you have really hard decisions to be made.
Wow. I love that point. I'm going to have to do another episode about that. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it here. And if you went through this episode and thought this, you aren't the only one, because at times John was talking and I'm like, I have no freaking clue what he's talking about. But that's why you go to Hirtle Callaghan. That's why, if you're managing endowment, you bring in a chief investment officer outside to help you through managing millions of dollars, which is not for the faint of heart. He's John Griffith. He's an endowment specialist with Hirtle Callaghan. John, we hope you had a good time on the podcast today. Thank you for bringing this incredible knowledge to the audience.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, you know what I'm going to say. You've just EdUp'd. Experience Element 451's Engage Summit Conference this June and get ready to unleash the power of AI in higher ed marketing. Deep dive into how this emerging tech will revolutionize the education landscape, from personalized student engagement to turbocharging your marketing efforts with AI. These sessions are guaranteed to help you smash your enrollment goals. Connect with like-minded professionals, explore cutting-edge edtech products and services, and leave with the knowledge to supercharge your institution's growth. Don't wait. Register now at engage.element451.com and seize your chance to lead the pack in the AI-driven education revolution. Use promo code EdUp50 for $50 off your registration. It's time to
Level up.
The beginning of a new era in higher education begins with you. Order your copy of Commencement, The Beginning of a New Era in Higher Education by Kate Colbert, Dr. Joseph Lucio, with contributions by Elvin Freitas. It's higher education's must-read book of 2022. Discover how you can seize the moment to change higher education forever. Commencement, The Beginning of a New Era in Higher Education, now available on Amazon. For bulk orders, contact Kate, Joe, or Elvin